First you trade the Cadillac for a microphone. Then you lie to me about the band. Now you're gonna put me right back in the joint.
They're not gonna catch us. We're on a mission from God.
It seems that my recent videos have stirred up something of a conflict between myself and Atheist in the comment section. Fear not, though, because I suspect I have the upper hand. See, the pro tip on winning any argument is don't pick a side until you know which side is the right side, and then just be on that side, because it's way easier to win an argument if all the best evidence seems to support your side. The alternative is to be on the wrong side, and then you're constantly trying to explain away what is becoming increasingly more apparent. But I digress. And to be fair, there has been some decent people that identify as atheists that have commented on my videos. And a lot of them are perfectly respectable. If you come to me and say, "Look, I'm a skeptic of the things that you believe. I'm just not convinced." And if you even want to go beyond that and say, "And here, look, this is my best argument for why I'm skeptical of the things that you believe." Well, I don't have a problem with that. That's perfectly respectable. And it's something that I do. Maybe not on this issue, but I question things that other people believe all the time. So I understand where that person is coming from, and they're being respectful. And there are some people like that. Maybe I'll try to put some of their comments up on the screen. But yeah, I'm going to be nothing but reciprocal to that person. I'll read or listen to what they have to say, and then I'll consider it. Because why wouldn't I? That said, there still seems to be something of an army of juvenile trolls that also identify themselves as atheists, leaving fruitless comments on my videos. And in some cases, I'll question them, the comment or two. And usually, after they try to answer a couple of questions, it becomes increasingly apparent that they're not actually being remotely reasonable. And if those types of atheists were all that existed, the childish, trollish ones, then atheism would be an even smaller minority than it is. And it might, if you're that person that I'm describing, it might seem like I'm insulting you, but actually I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to get you to realize that even if your beliefs were correct, or you might argue with my phrasing there. So even if your atheism is correct, let me say that. And even if it is really, like, if more people were atheists, if that would be a good thing, I don't believe that, but I'm assuming that you believe that. I'm telling you, you're a terrible proselytizer of your views. You really think a troll in the comments section is going to convince somebody that's convicted religiously to abandon their beliefs? Sit down and think about this for a while, for more than 10 seconds, before you respond in the comments section. What exactly are you trying to accomplish? But I'm going to get into this one commenter that I think is, he wasn't rude to me, and he was making an argument that I could follow. Now I'm going to find fault in it, and that's what I'm going to go over with in this video, but at least he was making an argument that I could follow and say, okay, what does this guy have to say? Where do I agree? Where do I disagree? So to set the context here, one of my recent videos was entitled "No Atheist in Foxholes," and basically my argument in the video was that hard times have a tendency to bring people closer to God, and that good times, often prosperous times, can do the opposite. When everything in your life is peachy, people tend to call on God less. It's easy for them to call on God to save them when times are tough, but in the prosperous times, it's hard for them to stay grateful for that state. And, I'm not really doing it justice. If you're interested, I'll link the video, No Atheist in Foxholes, in the description below, and you can view my entire case on the subject if you would like. So this user responds, if hard times breeds faith, isn't it better for the world to have less religion? By eliminating suffering from life, one also gets rid of a reason that for some people to become religious. Sounds like a great trade-off. Don't really see how this on its own portrays religion as good instead of evil. Okay, I'm going to disagree, but I can follow his reasoning, so I actually have something to disagree with. Some of you other people that leave just insulting comments on my channel, you're free to do that. I'm not going to delete your comments unless you give me a really, really good reason to. But learn from this guy's example. At least he's giving me something, tangible to respond to. So I respond, what is the cause of the hard times? I would contend that it is a falling away from not just a belief in God, but also godly principles that often brings about the hard times. It's more of a cycle. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail on this in a few posts. But so I can see what he's saying, but I'm telling him back that, look, it's the falling away of following godly principles that probably brought about the hard times in the first place. There's a cause and effect here that he's failing to grasp. So he writes back, pretty much all about the human condition is caused by fellow humans and their decisions. Yeah, that's largely true. There's circumstances that nobody has any control over, but there's a lot of circumstances that people have control over, and how they decide to manage those things often determines how good or how bad society is affected. It is absolutely within the power of humanity to wage less war and place less people into foxholes, to commit less crime, and to overall build a more just, equal, and prosperous society. And if we do so, there will be less religionness. So basically what he's saying is if people would just read the New Testament and sort of follow the example of Christ, okay, I'm reading words into his mouth, but this is going to be my point in a minute here. Where do we learn to wage less war? Where do we learn to put less people in foxholes? Where do we learn to commit less crime? And what are the root causes of crime, for example? Where do we learn to be more equal and just and the like? Whose example do we follow to get there? I mean, I have some suggestions, but I'm genuinely asking to anyone who wants to comment, who do we follow to get there? Do we just figure it out on our own, or is there some examples from the past that we might want to look into? As to the hard times caused by falling away from not just a belief in God, I would much rather live in a modern godless society with all the modern amenities, infrastructure, and services than go to a far more religious medieval society with horrible living standards, short lifespans, etc. Basically, all evidence suggests that human well-being and religiosity are inversely correlated on societal level. Well, are they now? Now, here's a thought. You say you much rather live in a modern society. Well, where did modern society come from exactly? I mean, if we look at the most prosperous society in material means, certainly America has some other problems, but I think lack of adherence to godly principles are actually at the root of those problems. But what were our founding generations like? Were they a religious people? What particular brand of religion did they follow? Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but my reading of history is that the country was seeded by pilgrims and nonconformists who wanted to come to the New World where there was more religious freedom, because they had, they were Christian, but they weren't the right brand of Christian in Europe, so they wanted to come to the New World where they could practice their faith in earnest and without a different religious tradition judging them for it. Now, there's certainly plenty of other reasons people began to immigrate to the New World, but that was a principal one, and then there was a lot of there was a lot of faithful people in the U.S. During its founding generation, and from a variety of traditions. Not just pilgrims, but different types of Baptists and eventually Catholics as well, Anglicans, Quakers. All different traditions of Christendom. And it was the case that the very first amendment that they put into their Constitution, the very first amendment in the Bill of Rights, protects religious freedom, protects the right of people to worship God in whatever way they see fit. And the reason is they wanted to prevent what they had seen in Europe, where a dominant sect would get control of the government, and they would basically try to force their brand of religious dogma onto everybody else. And the objection to that was not that they were a bunch of atheists and they didn't want to be forced to worship God. The objection to that is they were different brands of Christendom, and they didn't want one brand trying to monopolize the society and force everybody to go along with the dictates of their conscience. So if America, fast forward several generations, becomes the most prosperous society on the face of the earth, wouldn't that suggest that, no, the evidence doesn't say what this poster thinks it says? In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite, that devout religious people of faith give birth to very prosperous societies, at least in the case of the U.S., and at least in the case of a Christian worldview. So I respond to them, how do you explain the carnage in the 20th century? Certainly a very secular time, even in traditionally Christian countries, and in the vacuum, much more terrible beliefs sprang up. And that's my argument, that even though still the majority of the country would probably identify as Christian in one form or another, my argument isn't that, over the specific number of people that will raise up their hand if you ask them if they're a Christian, but what is the character of those people? Are they good Christians? Are they diligent followers of the teachings in the New Testament? Or are they just lukewarm Christians that profess but don't really practice? At least not with anything approaching zeal. And I think it's quite clear that a lot of the generations in the 20th century were not that zealous for following the New Testament. Our lives are much easier now because there's been a huge advance in technology. Because these earlier generations were laying the foundation, a good solid foundation for us to build on, we had an era of great prosperity, and things got better. We got wealthier, so we had more time and money to invest in advancing technology. And technology has made our life. It engineered the labor out of a lot of things, so it's made our lives a lot easier. So what type of generation gave birth to this explosion of wealth and technology? Was it the secular one, the one where people were less religious? Because you seem to be putting the cart before the horse here. That's my observation. Tell me if I'm wrong. So he responds, and I appreciate it, because so far he hasn't been rude, he hasn't insulted me. He's just responding to my arguments in kind. So he writes back, with all the carnage of the 20th century, it's still one of the most peaceful and prosperous times for humanity. Really? Is it really the most peaceful? We had, think of 1900 to the year 2000, aka the 20th century. We had World War I. Then we had a depression and World War II. After World War II, this left two competing superpowers, the U.S. and its allies, NATO, and then the Soviet Union, and to a lesser degree China, although they've become the dominant competing superpower in recent years. So this Cold War that existed between the U.S. and the Soviets led to innumerable proxy wars. You had Korea, Vietnam, all the conflicts in the Middle East. There was less known conflicts in Africa that were basically proxy wars between the U.S. and the Soviets. So By what measure was this a peaceful time? Prosperous in the sense that there was more technology, but that also meant that we've got much more advanced weapons to throw at each other. If you look back at remains of prehistoric people, most of them have at least some damage from fighting. Well, yeah, the history of man is plagued with conflict. I'm not so much concerned with that fact because it's a given, but what is worth digging into is what sorts of societies produce war, more conflict, and what sorts of societies are more peaceful. If you look at medieval times, the constant feudal conflicts were order of magnitude more destructive than the worst of world wars, especially if you account for the population difference. I don't know that that's correct. I think he might be wrong on that. My understanding of the medieval period is, but basically my understanding of before the modern age, it was much harder to mobilize an entire population or a large swath of a population into a war effort, simply because it was logistically impossible. Before a lot of the technological advances that we have, you just couldn't field a large army for any length of time because we were so primitive at producing things that you couldn't do that. You needed more people to grow you needed more hands growing the food and being productive, because if everybody's off fighting a war, who's going to grow the food? And you're just going to starve to death. This limited man's capacity to wage total war on another tribe or another nation. There was definitely conflict in the Middle Age period, but largely it was more, noblemen controlled a given territory, would have like something about their private professional armies or mercenaries that they would hire. And conflicts were often not between entire populations. It was between, competing noblemen, and they would fight amongst themselves with these professional armies. Relatively small in scale. It wasn't like they were conscripting, a bunch of peasants and going in and invading other countries, because they lacked the resources to do that on that scale. But I digress. So obviously I think his view is wrong, but I'm going to explain to him, I'm going to give him a good argument for why it's wrong. If we look at a wealthy developed country, so let's take out differences in wealth. Let's assume we're talking about people within a modern, prosperous country. What type of individual prospers more, and what type of individual struggles and tends to remain at the bottom of the ladder socially and economically? Who are the people that can afford to live in nice, safe neighborhoods, and who are the people that live in the slums, whether they're urban slums or whether they're rural slums in Appalachia? Regardless of what view on God a person confesses, I would argue that there is a clear correlation between adherence to biblical principles and an individual's prospects in society. This is not an exhaustive list, but for some examples. So here are some biblical principles that, well, if you follow them, probably lead you to a more successful, happier life. Waiting until marriage, or at least being in a stable relationship before procreating. Younger people respecting elders. Not being a criminal or violating the rights of others, i.e. theft, murder, etc. More generally, the fruits of the Spirit. Being humble, being charitable, being forgiving, seeking wisdom, and temperance. Temperance is a fancy word for sobriety and being balanced, as opposed to being out of control. And also developing a social circle of people who also exhibit the above traits. So like a good church community. Which, by the way, I'm trying to be a better example of myself. I've recently decided I'm going to start going to church again. Maybe I'll make a video about that. Now imagine the opposite. So the opposite behaviors of what I just outlined above. Poorly raised children born to incompetent parents that don't even get along with one another. Children that are not raised to respect their elders, or the rights of others, or the law. children that are proud, greedy, unforgiving, foolish, and out of control, so ill-temperate. And I didn't add this, but suppose you develop a circle of friends that exhibit all these behaviors. I think there's a proverb about that. Now, which of these groups of children are likely to build something resembling the kingdom of heaven? You know, that just world that he was longing for in previous comments. And which children are more likely to build hell on earth? Now, if you want evidence of what I'm saying, I offer it. Look around at different neighborhoods throughout the U.S. and tell me what values are lacking in the struggling ones and what values are more present in the successful ones. Now, you want evidence that there's truth in the New Testament or the Bible generally? Well, there it is. Now, you could debate over the divinity of its inspiration, but at the very least, if you're being reasonable, you should be able to conceive that there's some truth in those teachings. At least it would appear that experience and observation would bear that out. Those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below.